"Get out of this restaurant right now." The manager grabbed the elderly woman's arm as customers laughed from their tables. Her coat was faded at the cuffs. Her shoes were scuffed at the heels. To everyone in that dining room, she looked like a woman who didn't belong there, a woman who had wandered in off the street. Nobody at the surrounding tables said a word. Nobody stood up. Nobody even looked her in the eye. Except one waitress, a young woman named Grace Anderson, who set down the tray in her hands and walked straight toward the manager. What she said next would put her job on the line. And less than 24 hours later, the billionaire who owned that restaurant chain would walk through the front door and change every single life inside that building forever. But before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Now let's go back to where it all began. On an ordinary Tuesday afternoon in a small American town, inside a restaurant called the Brass Spoon. It was the kind of Tuesday that felt like every other Tuesday. The lunch rush had just ended, and the smell of fried onions and coffee still hung in the air. Grace Anderson had been working at the Brass Spoon for almost 2 years, ever since she dropped out of community college to help support her younger brother after their mother got sick. She was 23, tired in the way that only people who work double shifts understand, but she still smiled at every table she served. That afternoon, she noticed an elderly woman sitting alone near the window, her hands folded neatly on the table, watching the door as if she were waiting for someone who never seemed to arrive. The old woman wore a plain gray coat, the kind you might find at a thrift store, and her shoes were worn down at the heel. Her hair was pinned back in a simple bun, and her face carried the kind of stillness that comes from decades of patience. She ordered only a cup of tea, nothing else, and she sat with it for almost an hour without saying much at all. Grace noticed something strange though. The woman's eyes moved carefully around the restaurant, studying the staff, watching how they treated each customer, almost as if she were taking notes in her head. Who was she really waiting for? And why did she seem so calm in a place where everyone else seemed to be in a hurry? The restaurant manager, a sharp-tempered man named Richard Coleman, noticed the old woman too, but for a very different reason. He didn't see a quiet, patient guest. He saw a problem. "She's been sitting there for almost an hour and she's only ordered tea," he muttered to one of the cooks, loud enough for nearby tables to hear. "This isn't a shelter." A few customers chuckled. Richard had run that restaurant for 6 years, and in his mind, appearances meant everything. A woman in a thrift store coat, sitting alone, ordering nothing but tea, didn't fit the image he wanted for his dining room. He walked toward her table with his arms crossed, already deciding how this would end before he even said a word to her. "Ma'am, if you're not going to order anything else, I'm going to have to ask you to leave," Richard said, his voice flat and cold. The old woman looked up at him calmly. "I'm waiting for someone," she said softly. "He should be here soon." Richard rolled his eyes. "We've heard that one before," he said, and a nearby table of businessmen laughed under their breath. That was the moment something in the room shifted. Richard reached down and gripped the woman's arm, pulling her slightly from her seat. "Let's go. Now." The old woman didn't fight him. She didn't raise her voice. She simply looked at him with an expression that seemed almost amused, like a teacher watching a student fail a test they didn't know they were taking. Have you ever watched someone get humiliated in public and felt your stomach drop, wondering if you should say something? That's exactly what was happening inside Grace at that moment. She stood frozen for a second, watching the woman's arm in Richard's grip, watching the laughter at the tables around her, watching nobody else move. Something about it felt deeply wrong to her, not because the woman looked poor, but because of how calm she remained through all of it. Grace set down her tray and walked straight toward them. "Take your hands off her," she said, loud enough for the whole dining room to hear. Richard turned to her, stunned. "Excuse me?" he snapped. "This isn't your table, Grace. Stay out of it." But Grace didn't back down. "She hasn't done anything wrong," Grace said, stepping between Richard and the old woman. "She's allowed to sit here and drink her tea in peace, just like everyone else in this restaurant." Richard's face turned red with anger and embarrassment. especially with customers watching. If you keep talking, you're going to lose your job over this, he warned her. Grace's heart pounded, because she knew exactly what that meant. She needed this job. Her brother's medication wasn't cheap, and her mother's hospital bills hadn't stopped coming even after she passed away the year before. But in that moment, looking into the old woman's tired, grateful eyes, Grace realized she would rather lose her paycheck than lose the part of herself that knew right from wrong. "Then I guess I'm losing my job," she said quietly. "If you're still watching at this point, drop a comment with, 'I'm still here.' Let's see who's truly following this shocking story." The old woman reached out and gently touched Grace's hand. "Thank you, dear," she whispered. "But you don't have to do this." Grace shook her head. "Somebody should have done it a long time ago." Richard, humiliated in front of his own staff and customers, ordered Grace to finish her shift and report to his office before she left. The old woman quietly gathered her purse, thanked Grace one more time, and walked out the door without another word, leaving everyone wondering exactly who she was, and why she had been so calm through an experience that would have shattered most people. Grace couldn't shake the feeling that something about that woman didn't add up at all. That night, Grace sat on the edge of her bed, replaying the moment over and over in her mind. Had she really thrown away 2 years of steady work over a stranger? Her younger brother, Tyler, 16 years old and still grieving their mother, asked her what was wrong when he saw her staring blankly at the wall. "I might lose my job tomorrow," she admitted. "I stood up for someone today, and I don't regret it, but I'm scared about what happens next." Tyler hugged her and said something she would remember for the rest of her life. "Mom always said the right thing and the easy thing are rarely the same thing. Have you ever had to choose between doing what's right and protecting yourself? Tell us in the comments. We'd genuinely love to hear your story." The next morning, Grace arrived at the Brass Spoon expecting to be fired. Richard barely looked at her when she walked in, simply telling her to keep working until he decided what to do. The lunch rush came and went as usual, but there was a tension in the air that everyone could feel. Around 1 in the afternoon, a sleek black car pulled up outside the restaurant, and a man in a tailored navy suit stepped out. Word spread through the staff within seconds. It was Michael Whitfield, the billionaire owner of the company that operated the Brass Spoon and dozens of restaurants across the country. Richard nearly tripped over himself straightening his tie, instructing the staff to look sharp, certain this visit would be his chance to impress the boss. Nobody could have predicted what was about to happen next. Michael Whitfield walked through the front doors, and for a moment, everyone in the restaurant stood a little straighter, smiled a little wider, hoping to catch his attention. Richard stepped forward immediately, already rehearsing his greeting in his head, ready to show off the restaurant he had built. But Michael didn't even glance at him. He walked straight past the manager, past the hostess stand, past the tables of customers who turned to watch him, his eyes locked on something near the back of the dining room. Grace followed his gaze and felt her breath catch in her throat. Sitting quietly at a corner table, with her plain gray coat and her hands folded neatly in front of her, was the very same elderly woman from the day before. Michael walked directly to her table, dropped to his knees beside her chair, and wrapped his arms around her. "Mom," he said, his voice breaking. "I've been looking for you everywhere." The entire restaurant fell silent. Forks stopped mid-air. Conversations died mid-sentence. Richard's face went pale as the realization hit him like a wave of cold water. The woman he had grabbed by the arm, the woman he had humiliated in front of an entire dining room, was the mother of the very man who owned the company he worked for. Imagine being in that room at that exact moment. Would your stomach have dropped the way Richard's did? Would you have wished you could disappear? It turned out that Eleanor Whitfield, Michael's mother, had a habit nobody at the company knew about. Every few months, she would quietly visit one of her son's restaurants, dressed plainly, without telling anyone who she was, simply to see how ordinary customers were treated when nobody important was watching. It wasn't about catching people doing wrong. It was about learning the truth. She had done this for years, long before Michael's company became as large as it was, because she believed the way a business treats someone who looks like they have nothing tells you everything about what that business truly values. That day, She had simply lost track of time waiting for her son, who had been delayed in traffic on his way to pick her up after her doctor's appointment. Michael stood up slowly, his jaw tightening as Richard tried to stammer out an explanation. "Mr. Whitfield, sir, I had no idea. If I had known who she was." Michael cut him off immediately. "That's exactly the problem," he said. "You shouldn't need to know who someone is to treat them like a human being." He asked one of the staff to pull up the security footage from the previous day, and had it played on the small office monitor in front of the entire kitchen and dining staff. Every grabbed arm, every mocking laugh from nearby tables, every cold word Richard had spoken played out in silence as everyone watched what had truly happened the day before. "You weren't fired because you mistreated my mother?" Michael said, his voice steady but firm, as Richard stood frozen watching the footage of himself on the small screen. "You're fired because that footage revealed exactly who you really are when you thought nobody important was watching." Richard tried to argue, tried to explain himself, but the room had already turned against him. Even some of the customers who had laughed the day before looked down at their plates, ashamed of their own silence. Richard was escorted out of the building that same afternoon, his 6 years at the Brass Spoon ending in less than 10 minutes. What would you have felt in that moment, watching someone face the consequences of cruelty they thought no one would ever see? Grace, meanwhile, stood quietly near the kitchen doorway, certain she would be next, certain that standing up the day before had marked the end of her job too. But Eleanor walked over to her, took both of her hands, and held them gently. "You're the reason I wasn't afraid yesterday," Eleanor said. "You reminded me that there are still good people in this world who don't need a reason to do the right thing." Michael turned to Grace next, studying her for a long moment. "What's your name?" he asked. "Grace," she answered, her voice barely above a whisper. "Grace Anderson," Michael repeated, as if memorizing it. "I think you and I are going to be talking again very soon." Over the following weeks, Eleanor began returning to the Brass Spoon, not in disguise this time, but simply as herself, often asking specifically to be seated in Grace's section. The two women talked for hours during slow afternoons, about Grace's mother who had passed away the year before, about Tyler and his dream of becoming an engineer, about the long nights Grace had spent worrying over bills that never seemed to stop arriving. Eleanor listened the way few people ever truly listen, without judgment, without rushing to offer advice. She began to see in Grace the same quiet strength she had once carried herself, decades earlier, before she married into a life of comfort she never took for granted. What most people at the restaurant didn't know was that Michael Whitfield carried a sadness of his own. 3 years earlier, he had lost his wife, Sarah, to a long illness that had taken her slowly, piece by piece, until there was nothing left for the doctors to do. Since then, he had buried himself in work, building his company into something larger every year, while quietly avoiding anything that resembled connection. Eleanor worried about her son constantly, watching him grow more distant with every passing year, wondering if he would ever allow himself to feel anything again. When she saw the way Grace had stood up for a stranger without hesitation, without calculating what it might cost her, something in Eleanor's heart recognized exactly the kind of person her son needed in his life. 6 months later, Michael found himself returning to the Brass Spoon more often than he ever had before, always finding a reason to stop by during Grace's shift. At first, it was simple conversation over coffee after the restaurant closed. Then it became dinners that lasted longer than either of them planned. Grace was hesitant at first, aware of the enormous gap between her life and his, worried that people would assume she was only interested in his money. But Michael never once made her feel small for where she came from. "My mother raised me to judge people by what they do when no one's watching," he told her one evening. "And what you did that day is the bravest thing I've ever seen. Have you ever met someone unexpectedly who completely changed the direction of your life?" That's exactly what happened to Grace, who never imagined that one decision to stand up for a stranger would lead her here. As their friendship slowly grew into something deeper, Eleanor watched from the sidelines with quiet joy, careful never to push them together too quickly, simply grateful to see her son laughing again, truly laughing, for the first time in years. One evening, as the three of them shared dinner together, Eleanor squeezed Grace's hand under the table and whispered, "Thank you for bringing him back to life." Grace didn't fully understand what those words meant until much later, when she realized just how far Michael had come since that first humiliating afternoon. 1 year after that fateful day at the Brass Spoon, Michael and Grace were married in a small ceremony surrounded by close family and friends, with Eleanor seated in the front row, tears streaming down her face as she watched her son exchange vows with the woman who had once risked everything for a complete stranger. Tyler, now a year older and thriving in his studies thanks to the scholarship the Whitfield family had quietly arranged for him, stood proudly beside his sister. It wasn't a fairy tale built on luxury or status. It was built on something far rarer, the simple truth that kindness, even when it costs you everything, has a way of finding its way back to you eventually. Shortly after the wedding, Grace made a decision that surprised even Michael. Instead of stepping away from work entirely into a life of comfort, she used a portion of the family's resources to open a small foundation called Eleanor's Table, dedicated to supporting restaurant workers and service employees who found themselves in financial crisis. The same kind of crisis Grace had once lived through herself. She remembered every late shift, every unpaid bill, every moment she had felt invisible to the people she served, and she wanted to make sure others in that position had somewhere to turn. Eleanor, now in her early 70s, often visited the foundation's small office, proud beyond words of what her daughter-in-law had built from nothing but compassion and memory. Almost 2 years after he was fired from the Brass Spoon, Richard Coleman walked through the doors of Eleanor's Table, unemployed, behind on rent, and barely recognizable from the confident manager he had once been. He had drifted between jobs since his termination, his reputation in the industry damaged by what so many had witnessed that day. He didn't recognize the woman behind the front desk at first, not until she looked up and their eyes met. It was Grace. For a long, heavy moment, neither of them said a word, the weight of that humiliating afternoon hanging silently between them. What do you think Grace should have done in that moment? Would you have turned him away after everything he had done? Richard lowered his eyes, embarrassed beyond words, and quietly asked if there might be any work available, even something small, anything to help him through a difficult season in his life. Grace studied him for a long moment, remembering Eleanor's hands wrapped around hers on the day everything changed, remembering the words Eleanor had spoken so many times since. "Kindness isn't about deciding who deserves it," Eleanor had once told her. "It's about deciding who you want to be." Grace nodded slowly and told Richard there was an opening in the foundation's logistics department, helping coordinate support for service workers exactly like the one she used to be. Richard broke down in tears, unable to understand why she would help the very man who had once tried to destroy her. "I'm not doing this for you," Grace told him gently. "I'm doing this because of the woman who taught me that everyone deserves a second chance, even the people who never gave her one." Richard worked at Eleanor's Table for the next several years, slowly rebuilding not just his career, but the part of himself he had lost somewhere along the way, the part that used to believe people mattered more than appearances. Eleanor lived long enough to watch her foundation grow into something that helped thousands of struggling workers across the country, surrounded by a family she never expected, built from a single act of courage inside a restaurant on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon. If you were Grace, sitting across from the very man who once humiliated you and threatened your job, would you have offered him a second chance? Or would you have walked away? And if you were Eleanor, sitting alone in that restaurant being mocked by strangers, would you have remained as calm as she did, trusting that the truth would eventually come to light? This story reminds us that the people we overlook, the ones who seem to have nothing, are often carrying more strength, more history, and more dignity than we will ever fully understand. The next time you're tempted to judge someone by their coat or their shoes, or the way they carry themselves, remember Eleanor Whitfield, sitting quietly by the window, simply waiting to see who would treat her with kindness when she expected nothing in return. Let us know in the comments how this story made you feel, and whether you've ever witnessed a moment of kindness or cruelty that changed someone's life forever. If this story touched you, share it with someone who needs a reminder that small acts of courage can change everything.